I better check, make sure this is actually part 6 or 7. I can't remember what part this is. Yeah, this is part 6. Okay, just making sure. Okay, just put that away. All right, late enough as it is, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Samuel, and I need to adjust this lighting because it's kind of weird right now. Okay, I think that's better. Let me know if I need to fix the lighting again, and I might need to. Anyway, hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Samuel, and today we are starting from chapter 19. If you want to follow along, I will be using the New International Version, or NIV. You can use, your Bible app, or use like Bible Gateway for a free Bible, basically. And if you want to follow along, I encourage you to. I encourage you guys to, read the Bible yourselves, but I'm always here, to help with some misconceptions as well as, various aspects of Scripture that aren't as obvious as, you might think they would be. But, I'm here to help, and we're going to be reading today more of David's journey in the book of Samuel. So I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we will begin. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, you would reveal yourself to us, and we would understand the bigger picture of what you are doing with not just human history, but with our individual lives and how we can move forward in life. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right, so just to get a little bit up to speed, if you missed last week, so basically we are introduced to David, a well-known biblical figure, as he is the one who is known for killing the giant Goliath, which we read last week. And he's one of the great kings of Israel, as Israel had a long line of them. And of course, David is the beginning of what is known as the Davidic line. Of course, that's important because Jesus is associated a lot with the Davidic line, as he comes from it. So, at least that is what is believed. Of course, Jesus transcends even the idea of the Davidic line, but the way he is born into this world is through the Davidic line. And so here we're talking about the guy, who started it, David himself. And he's in an interesting predicament because at first, he's introduced as this great guy, and he does some pretty awesome stuff. But the current king of Israel, Saul, he don't like David getting popular. He don't like that, people are hoping David will be king. As Saul's probably put two and two together that David is the person that Samuel was talking about when Samuel told Saul that Saul would no longer be king and that someone else would take his place. And so, this good looking, badass warrior who everybody loves shows up. Saul's like, oh, this is the guy. This guy's a threat to my current rule. And so there's this tension between them, and it's gonna go from 0 to 100 real quick, right? And it ain't good for either of them. And it will actually put Israel in a bit of a tizzy. But that's kind of where we're at now, and we're gonna see this escalation of Saul's jealousy toward David and how serious it gets. This now leads us to chapter 19, where we are now going to read about this is that Saul and David, it's more than a rivalry now. It'll become much more than a rivalry. Chapter 19. So Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stay with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I'll find out. So Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul and said to him, Let not the king do wrong to his servant David, as he has not wronged you. And what has he done that has benefited you greatly? He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. And he brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul like before. Now once more, war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. David struck them with such force that they fled before him. But a harmful spirit came from the Lord upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in hand. And while David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. And that night, David made his escape. Now Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at its head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, Oh, but he's very ill. Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, Bring him up to me in his bed, so that I may kill him. But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and the head was some goat's hair. So Saul said to Michal, Why did you deceive me like this, and send my enemy away, so that he has escaped? And Michal told him, He said to me, Let me get away. Why should I kill you? When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah, and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. Now word came to Saul, David is in Naioth at Ramah. So Saul sent some men. So Saul sent some men, and they also prophet. Whoop, I skipped there. Verse 20. So Saul sent some men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent even more men. And they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time, and they also prophesied. Finally, he himself left for Ramah, and went to the great cistern at Seku. And he asked, Where are Samuel and David? Now over in Naioth at Ramah, they said, So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah. But the Spirit of God came even onto him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his garments, and he prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all the day and all the night. And this is why people say, Is Saul also among the prophets? Okay, so chapter 19 is it's kind of a weird one. So first we have Jonathan trying to be a good guy here, and this is why like people love this guy, right? So Saul is out to try and kill David because Saul's all super jealous and worried that David's gonna take his throne, and Jonathan's all like trying to settle this like rivalry between his dad and his best friend, I guess you could say. And Jonathan, he does what he can, right? And I think the thing that's really respectable about him is that he has a very level head. Because it's so easy to like, you see where like Saul gets really emotional, and even David gets like, he acts on impulse to protect himself, really. I mean, to be fair, I mean, anyone would. What you need in a situation like this is someone with a level head, right? And Jonathan is that person, and it's a very admirable feat. It's a very admirable thing about him that Jonathan really thinks this through, and that's what makes him likable. I've always liked Jonathan as a character, and trying to have Jonathan wants peace, in Israel, and that makes sense, right? I mean, that's Jonathan is the kind of guy we need in the world today, right? Just a guy who's just like, hey man, why can't we all just get along and not try and kill each other, right? And so he tries to convince his dad that like, David's not your enemy, he never was, he's always been so good to you and he serves you faithfully. And then of course like Saul makes this oath about like how, well, as long as the Lord lives, which I guess implies is that, forever, David will not, I won't put David to death, right? Of course, even though the Bible's like, oh, Saul makes this promise to like spare David. I mean, remember, this is Saul we're talking about, not the best guy for oaths, right? We know his track record ain't all that good. So, this ain't gonna hold. But, Jonathan tried. And of course, like, Jonathan tries to, have David come back, but this doesn't last, right? And there's a funny, it's almost comical where you know we have the same scene play out. I swear this is not a typo, where like yeah, the same scene more or less plays out. David is playing music for Saul when he's in a bad mood, and then Saul has a spear in hand and throws it at the guy, right? I mean, this has happened before. Maybe David should have been a lot more skeptical and a lot more alert as soon as he saw that like Saul had his spear in hand. I was like, getting a sense of deja vu here. But I mean that kind of how do I put it? Puts the final nails in the coffin, right? This kind of like confirms that David's like, okay, this ain't gonna work, right? Like Saul's tried this like 3 times now. Like things aren't gonna get better between us. And David had to be realistic about that, which is why he runs off. Then we have the little scenario with like David and Michal. And Michal is also kind of like Jonathan, right? Where, has a great liking to David, obviously because she's married to the guy for starters. And so she, wants to protect him, right? From even her own dad. And what's interesting here is that I guess, like, similar to Jonathan, Michal just knows. She just knows that, like, well, David will be the future king, and so it is our duty to protect him, right? Which is an interesting thing because, once again, the book of Samuel, at the very least, points out multiple times that it's actually the king's job to protect other people, right? As the team leader, the king is supposed to protect everyone else. But you see, a lot of this traditional, people giving their lives to protect the king, right? And of course, that's what makes them such good characters. Like Jonathan and Michal are wonderful characters. They're great people because of this, right? And they're pretty selfless. They obviously, by preserving David, are giving up their own royal titles, because if David becomes king, then they lose their royal titles, because then, their family's no longer on the throne. They no longer have a dynasty. But, there are things obviously more important than status, right? And Michal, just like Jonathan, notice this. They know that. A couple other little observations, since like chapter 19 is mostly like, here's a set of events. It's funny where does Michal get like this idol to use as like a body dummy, right? I'm like, I thought with Saul and David around, you think they would have gotten rid of most of the household idols, but I mean, I guess it's one of those things that you can never really get rid of them, right? But Michal just has one on hand, which I guess comes pretty handy here, and uses it as like a dummy, basically. So when like Saul comes looking for David, it's just like grabs the bed sheet. It's just like this like block of stone with goat's hair on it. I wonder how that scene would have played out. Probably would have been pretty funny. And then Saul, being less than thrilled, I'm sure. Then finally we get this last part where like David goes to Samuel at Ramah. My pronunciation of it is never consistent, and I don't expect yours to be either. So, but David goes to Samuel, and Samuel's like, "Yeah, I'll protect you. I mean, after all, I am the guy who basically announced that you're going to be the next king, more or less." And so David is staying with Samuel, and what happens, we don't see it obviously, but the Bible implies that like David was mentored by Samuel for a while, because the next chapter, the next couple, I think it's like at the end of the next chapter, at the end of chapter 20 more or less, David has to leave. He has to, actually be on the run from Saul. And so before that actually happens, like however long that is, David is mentored by Samuel for a little while. Of course, like, to be fair, everybody would want Samuel to be their mentor because he's the big name at the moment, right? Because he's like the main prophet of Israel. Then you have this kind of funny scene where, like, Saul sends men to go after Samuel and David because they find out where they are. And then when they get there, they're just like, singing praises to God and prophesying and stuff like that. And then, like, they don't actually do what Saul told them to do. And then after like 3 tries, the Bible goes on this humorous, like almost comical scenario where, like, Saul himself goes. And he too is just like prophesying instead of, doing what he set out to do. But of course, this is how God passively, I guess you could say, protects David here too, right? He just, how do I put it? He just, like, in his presence, there's a force, like, you cannot be violent. That's kind of what happens. I don't know, that's the best way I can explain it. And that's why nobody can be aggressive here, right? Everybody's just, like, praying and stuff. And I guess when you're in the presence of God, you can't help but pray, which I guess makes sense, right? But, we have Saul prophesying, and of course the old saying keeps coming up, which is funny that the Bible brings it up. That, how does the Bible word it? In verse 24, this is why people say, is Saul among the prophets? Of course, this is like a throwaway line the Bible uses, and we don't have a lot of other, like, we don't really have anything else to go on where, like, why would people think this? And other implications of prophesying, right? Because of course prophesying has, like, is a very loaded term. I mean, what the heck does that even mean, right? So, you think of, like, modern churches, and this is, like, terrible example, but, like, when people think of, like, prophesying, they think of, like, the speaking in tongues thing, when people do all that funny chatter. That's part of it. And then of course people, if you're like an outsider of the church kind of thing, you see, like, people like the speaking in tongues thing, and it's like totally weird, and it is weird. Anyone who anyone who says otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. It is weird, but at the same time, it's like, it's one of those things you can't help but do when you're in the presence of God. So it's kind of one of those. It's weird like that, but I mean, it's one of those. It's hard to rationalize because it's like, what happens when the spirit realm and our world meet, kind of thing, right? Of course, weird stuff is gonna happen. Speaking in tongues is like probably the least weird thing, even though it's pretty weird, right? And so stuff like this would happen with, like, with Saul, right? And of course, the Bible even points out, like, Saul, like, strips naked and lies on the ground, prostrating himself on the ground, face on the floor, whatever, right? Just, like, praying and whatever, right? And of course, like, I assume the Bible's like, and David probably made, like, another little getaway there too, right? So that, Saul couldn't hurt him. I mean, he was already, like, in that spiritual trance that he wouldn't hurt David because, well, God was protecting David. I guess it's the simplest explanation. Occam's razor, right? So the simplest explanation is that why everybody would just prophesy when they would approach Samuel was because it was a miracle basically. So yes, a miracle attributed to Samuel somewhat. It's whatever. But like, yeah, God protecting David from Saul and making it in a non-violent way for a change. Because I know everybody remembers like all the more violent interventions God has, right? Because he's got a lot of them. But here it's one of the weird cases where it's like a non-violent intervention, and it's just it is a little jarring when you think of that too, right? No crazy fire tornadoes, no crazy like magic cloud, right? None of that. It's just like, oh, people just want to prostrate themselves and pray. All right, it's a not a spectacular miracle, but I can roll with it, right? Kind of one of those things, but that's chapter 19. Not much to say about it. It's pretty straightforward. And I think it, of course, like, I don't have a lot to say about chapter 19 because chapter 20 has a lot more because, of course, this is where, like, the narrative really picks up. And, of course, we enter an interesting chapter in this David v. Saul storyline. So let's dive in. Chapter 20. Then David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked. Oh, all right, I gave David my normal voice. I was like, what have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to kill me? Never, Jonathan replied. You are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It isn't so. But David took an oath and said, Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes. And he has said to himself, Jonathan must not know, or he will be grieved. Yet as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, there is only one step between me and death. So Jonathan said to David, Whatever you want me to do, I'll do it for you. So David said, Look, tomorrow is the new moon festival, and I'm supposed to dine with the king. But let me go and hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow. If your father misses me at all, tell him, David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his clan. And if your father says, Very well, then your servant is safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure he is determined to harm me. As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father? Never, said Jonathan. If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you? And David asked, Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Come, Jonathan said. Let's go out into the field. So they went there together. Then Jonathan said to David, I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, that I will surely sound out my father by this time the day after tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed toward you, I will not send you word, will I not send you word and let you know? But if my father intends to harm you, may the Lord deal with Jonathan, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. But show me unfailing kindness like the Lord's kindness as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family. Not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, May the Lord call David's enemies to account. Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan said to David, Tomorrow is the new moon feast. You will be missed because your seat will be empty. The day after tomorrow, toward evening, go to the place where you hid when this trouble began, and wait by the stone Ezel. I will shoot 3 arrows through the side of it, as though I were shooting a target. Then I will send a boy and say, Go find the arrows. If I say to him, Look, the arrows are on this side of you, bring them here. Then come, because as surely as the Lord lives, you are safe. There is no danger. But if I say to the boy, Look, the arrows are beyond you, then you must go, because the Lord has sent you away. And about the matter you and I discussed, remember, the Lord is witness between you and me forever. So David hid in the field, and when the new moon feast came, the king sat down to eat. He sat in his customary place by the wall, opposite Jonathan. And Abner sat next to Saul, but David's place was empty. Saul said nothing that day, for he thought, Something would have happened to David to make him ceremonially late. Something must have happened to David to make him ceremonially unclean. I don't know why I said late there. Surely he is unclean. But the next day, the 2nd day of the month, David's place was empty again. Then Saul said to his son Jonathan, Why hasn't the son of Jesse come to the meal, either yesterday or today? Jonathan answered, David earnestly asked me for permission to go to Bethlehem. He said, Let me go, because a family is a... Sorry. That part was also Jonathan speaking. Let's try that again. Verse 28. So Jonathan answered, David earnestly asked me for permission to go to Bethlehem. He said, Let me go, because a family is observing a sacrifice in the town, and my brother had ordered me to be there. If I have found favor in your eyes, let me get away to see my brothers. That is why he has not come to the king's table. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. But why must he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. So Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger. On the 2nd day of the feast, he did not eat. because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. Now in the morning, Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David, and he had a young boy with him. And he said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called out after him, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" Then he shouted, "Hurry, go quickly, don't stop." The boy picked up the arrow and returned. The boy picked up the arrow and returned to his master. Since the boy knew nothing about this, only Jonathan and David knew. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said, "Go, carry him back to town." After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times, with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. So, chapter 20. Man, Jonathan had a lot of speaking lines. I didn't think he had that many. I don't know how long I was able to keep that voice going, too. But anyway, Jonathan, him being a stand-up guy, standing up for his buddy David, right? But, of course, now we've seen, Saul really, escalate his... I guess we can say it's a hatred now toward David, right? I mean, it's definitely not a rivalry anymore, but it's a pure hatred. I mean, he's so blinded by hatred that he almost kills his own son because Jonathan was trying to protect David, right? Like, Saul is so far gone now and obviously has lost his mind. And you'll see how much he's lost his mind, right? Because Saul clearly not really all there anymore. But it really begs the question, though, about how do I put this? How would people? I guess there is an answer. It's probably a stupid answer, but I was thinking of obviously there were witnesses there, right? Like watching Saul kind of descend into madness, right? Like, who would actually follow this guy? But of course, he's the king, so I don't think people really have a choice. But I mean, people see this, right? And it just adds on to making Saul look like a really bad guy, right? Because remember, we're past the his redeeming virtues. Yeah, we're past that, right? He's gone to full villain mode in this mad quest for maintaining his power and to kill David in order to do that. But yeah, it's interesting to see that God originally chose this guy to be okay, I want you to lead my people Israel, since the people want a king. And even just because you're chosen by God doesn't make you immune, right? As we see Saul, we see Saul in his descent to madness, and it's one of those things that it's something all too real, right? Because you can think of this kind of thing happening to people today, right? Just because you had a good start in life, like Saul did, anyone can have that descent into madness. And it's a scary thought, but it's one of those things that, like, yeah, we have to face that challenge. And I mean, one of the real question, I guess, is, you know, when that comes upon you, do we trust that God will carry us through it, or do we allow the madness to consume us like it has with Saul, right? And this is funny because, like, last chapter, back in chapter 19, there was a moment where, like, Saul got to reconnect with God, right? When Saul was after David and the presence of God came upon him, right? And, you know, Saul must have, like, been quite elated that, like, that the Spirit of God was upon him again, and probably old feelings when he was, a better person. But even his time at Naoth didn't, like, prevent him from falling into this madness, right? And it's a pretty terrifying thing to think about, but that's how it be. And that's why, reading the book of Samuel is an interesting read, because, we see these darker corners in, like, Israel's leaders, right? And that, you know, no one is a paragon of virtue like we like to believe. But with that being said, that's all the more reason to be introspective and watch what could happen to yourself, right? And so Saul's descent into madness is a very interesting thing to observe here in chapters 19 and 20. And I felt like that was kind of a more important thing to focus on, as opposed to, like, Jonathan and David's, like, bromance, basically. Because once again, I I want you guys to focus on, the revelation that God gave Samuel, right? That only God can be king, right? And it is our rejection of God as our king is why, you know, we run into so many problems as we do. And looking at Saul's descent into madness is like, yeah, any human leader can have this moment, right? This descent into madness, and that is not a good place you want to be, right? Because this can happen to any human leader. And as we read later chapters, you see how badly this actually kind of screws Israel over. Because, a human leader that has gone nuts, basically, yeah, you're basically doomed, right? And, you know, whether, some people may chalk this up as a bit of a joke, but, that's kind of how it is in the world today, right? Because no matter where you are in the world, each country has their own version of their leaders descending into madness, right? And it's obviously doing a lot of damage to the country, right? To their respective countries, right? And so, yeah, it's something that is a very serious thing. But now, of course, I know a lot of people may think the more nihilistic route and be like, well, what's the point then, right? Any system on Earth needs a human leader, and since all human leaders are possibly able to descend into madness, then what hope is there, right? And that's a legitimate question to ask, because, what hope is there? But, there's all the more reason that, like, when Jesus came and died for our sins, and more importantly, rose from the dead to overcome the power of sin, then there is a way, right? As God transcends, as Jesus Christ transcends the powers that cripple us on earth, right? Death being the ultimate one, but all the little steps along the way, descent into madness being one of them, right? And that's something that is where we place our hope, right? That is the foundation of, Christianity, is that our hope is in Jesus, who transcends all those things, right? Death being the ultimate level, but that descent into madness we see here would be one of the steps that move toward it, right? Because after all, you tend to have the descent into madness before you know, enter the mass death area. They tend to one tends to lead to the other. Let's just say that. I mean, the only other real observation here is, this kind of bromancy moment with like David and Jonathan. It's just like adorable to see, right? Like they're just that close. They're just like the bestest of buddies, right? That they fight for each other like that. And it's interesting because in a way they're the only family. They view each other as the only real family they have, right? Because David's probably been separated from his brothers and his father for a long time, working for Saul all these years. And of course, Jonathan witnessing his father's descent into madness, like, well, clearly I can't really view my own father as family when he's bat crap crazy, right? So, yeah, I mean, this 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 bromance that they have is kind of the necessitates out of like the lack of other family. I mean, sure, there's Mikal as well, but Mikal just kind of disappears from the picture, so it's like, huh, right? But just gotta deal with it, I guess. Mikal has kind of written out the story for now, anyway. She does come back much later, but let's just say things are different when that happens. Okay, I know I'm speeding through this a little bit, but let's move on to chapter 21. Because one of the nice things about reading, like, one of the narratives in the Bible is that, a lot of it is actually like, it's pretty straightforward, right? Because, I mean, you're just going through the story and you're going through the motions of the story, as good storytelling does, right? You just go with the you just go with the flow of the story. Chapter 21. So David went to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. Now Ahimelech trembled when he met him, and said, "Why are you alone? Or why is no one with you?" So David answered Ahimelech, the priest, "The king has sent me on a mission, and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' And David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us, as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy even on missions that are not so holy. So how much more so today?' So the priest gave him the consecrated bread. Since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken. Now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg. Dweg. That's how you pronounce it, I think. Doeg? I'm going to say Dweg. the Edomite, Shaul's chief shepherd. Now David asked Ahimelech, don't you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon, because the king's mission was urgent. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one. And David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. So that day, David fled from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? That Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands? David took these words to heart, and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence, and while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate, and letting saliva run down his beard. Achish said to his servants, oh, look at this man. He is insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short on madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house? Chapter 21 is a short one. So chapter 21, we get the beginning of, the renegade chapters, or, David on the run. But I like to call it the Renegade David. And Renegade David he's an interesting fellow, right? Because, he does some shifty things, right? Like, he goes to Ahimelech and he just straight up lies to the guy, right? You gotta feel bad for this guy, Ahimelech. Just some priest guy doing his job. And then David, he basically lies to the guy, which is not good. Now, of course, the easy defense that's thrown at David is that, like, well, he had to protect himself from Saul. Alright, that's fine. But, once again, one of the things that you have to be careful about with the words you say is that, they affect other people, right? They don't just affect you. And so, for David to make this lie to Ahimelech could be very problematic, as we will later see. But, yeah, David, once again, sure, David is, like, the guy that God anointed to be king, but David does some shifty things and cuts a lot of corners in life, and he does some questionable things, and lying to Ahimelech, the priest, is one of those things, right? Because, Ahimelech trying to be a nice guy. And of course, like, some people may give him a bit of crap for, like, being so strict about the bread of the presence. Which, if you don't know what that is, I talked a little bit about it in my Exodus reading, but Exodus only covers, like, a little bit. But the bread of the presence was basically, like, there were a set of hot cakes kind of set aside that after they, went to do burnt offerings with God and whatever, right, in the tabernacle, then instead of burning up the bread or, like, giving it to the priest as, like, you tend to do with regular sacrifices, the bread was actually put inside the Ark of the Covenant and was kept there. And then after a while they would take it out and then they would put new ones in. It's kind of weird. They just did that. But whatever, right? This is just part of what they did. So the bread of the presence was this, like, special bread that was for God, and they left it in the ark, and then, they would change it once in a while. But it was supposed to be like this special bread that goes to God and is not given to anyone else. And so, Ahimelech's reluctance is like, well, this is holy bread. I mean, this is the bread we offered God, and we normally don't give this to anyone else. But I don't have anything else, right? Of course, once again, Ahimelech is kind of cutting corners, right? Because technically, the bread of the presence is meant to be thrown out after a while, right? They just leave it, and then they let it like break down, decay, or whatever, right? Because they're not supposed to eat it. But Ahimelech's kind of like, well, I could give it to you, I guess, because like I don't have anything else, and it would be worse if I didn't give you anything. So, I mean, you just feel bad for Ahimelech because he's like stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? And he's like, I want to be nice, I want to obey commands of loving my neighbor, especially David, but at the same time, this is the bread of the presence, right? What do I do? But he tries to make a compromise. It's like, okay, well, it's holy bread. You guys haven't been with any women though, right? Like, not doing regular people things, right? You made yourselves holy before God and did all the purity cleansing and all that stuff, right? That's what's Ahimelech trying to like get around, like not supposed to give people the bread of the presence, but at the same time not wanting to have David walk away empty-handed. Because I mean, once again, like more like in the Bible teaches that latter would be worse, right? To let David just go empty-handed. But at the same time, Ahimelech is trying to uphold, the significance of the bread of the presence, right? So he's just like, what do I do? It's just a funny moment between them, I'm sure. And then, of course, like, there's the other thing that, like, how is David not kind of sus here, right? So first he's like, I want a secret mission from the king. You got any food? Because I don't have any. And then he later says, well, I actually don't have a weapon on me either. It's like, wait, what? Like, it doesn't matter who you are. You're always with weapon, right? And I mean, I brought it up before, but I'll bring it up again. One of those funny video game tropes where it's like in RPGs where like you can have a class like the priest class and everybody knows how to fight because you don't just fight to live, but you live to fight. Everybody fights because that's how the ancient world was. And so since everybody fight to live and live to fight, you're never without weapon, right? That would just be silly, especially in the cruel, unforgiving ancient world, right? Like, you would never be without weapons. And David's just like, yeah, I don't have a weapon on me. Do you got anything in here? First of all, you're like, I guess it's not a temple. There's no temple yet. And it's just I guess it's like his parish, which is like, I don't know, a little house he designates to like do the rites, I guess. I mean, it's not a church. It's not what we would consider as a church either, because it's like his house, right? But then as the priest, Ahimelech's house is also like the place where they do like all the temple stuff, even though there wasn't a temple yet. It's kind of confusing, I know, but remember, this is before the temple was built, and so the way they did things was kind of much more casual. And of course, there would have been like I guess the tabernacle could have been around too. I mean, if he has the bread of the presence, I guess they have a tabernacle. Which then brings up an interesting question. When David asks for a weapon, and let's assume they're at a tabernacle, because where else would they get the bread of the presence? I love how like Ahimelech's like, well, we don't have any real weapons here. Well, first of all, that's like going to a church and asking for a gun, right? You're not gonna find like a church is not a gun shop, but here's David asking Ahimelech, you got any weapons here? It's like, dude, we're in the tabernacle. We don't have weapons here. I mean, unless you take one of the acacia wood sticks and use as a bow staff, maybe. But like, otherwise, we don't have any real weapons here. I mean, this is where we do sacrifices to God. Why would we have a weapon here? I mean, I guess it would be the knife that they use to kill animals, but it's a ceremonial knife as opposed to like a weapon. You get what I mean. Just hilarious when David asks them for a weapon. And then it's even more hilarious that like, oh yeah, we have Goliath's sword here as like a trophy. So it's like, what? You just like take the cool weapon from your enemy and just leave it in the temple / tabernacle as like a trophy. This is kind of bizarre, but once again, ancient world people did funny things. This is one of them. And so like Goliath's sword is just sitting in the tabernacle as like a trophy. I mean, to be fair, it must have been quite the trophy. As I mentioned in like last week's reading, where I read the David Goliath story, and I mentioned that like Goliath must have had like a giant sword or something, because he himself was a huge dude. So maybe that's one reason why they would have kept it as a trophy. Because once again, like if Goliath has like this giant sword, most of the time this weapon would be pretty impractical for actual combat. And I made the joke where like, you know, when David is using it, it's kind of like, you know, those anime characters who have like giant swords clearly overcompensating for something. Yeah, so it would make sense that like the sword would be kept as a trophy, though not in the tabernacle of all places. But that's besides the point. But the Goliath sword is kept as a trophy because it makes sense for it to be. Because it wouldn't make sense for them to actually use it because the sword is like this giant, you know, comically large weapon that would be pretty useless in most people's hands, right? Of course, once again, you know, as I mentioned before, that like David clearly like he's got some mad guns because he can use this thing, and it's implied he uses it like from here on forward, right? Of course, like David must have had other swords as well, but that means like David is even more badass, right? Because he's got like regular sword, and then he's got giant sword, you know, for those special moments. But yeah, so David is given Goliath's sword, and now David gets to be anime protagonist with his oversized weapon. And he's got some, you know, consecrated bread that normal people aren't supposed to eat. But Jesus does make reference to this scene when Jesus talks about, like, isn't caring for your neighbor more important than tradition? And that's where Ahimelech is actually kind of interesting, right? Because I guess even back then, this is way before Jesus shows up on the scene. And Ahimelech gets this, right? That, yeah, you know, providing for a hungry person is more important than tradition. Even though he, you know, Ahimelech does like some compromise. But this scene is actually referred to by Jesus much later when Jesus is talking about how didn't David and his men eat the bread of the presence? Isn't that unlawful for them to do? As it was. But what was more important, right? Keeping up tradition or helping people? And so Ahimelech gets brownie points because he did the more important thing. Help people. I don't know, I guess a bit of a... I just felt a little bit sore here for that quick second there. Anyway, going back with like my point about, you know, Goliath's giant sword. I mean, David even points it out in verse 9, the very last part of verse 9, where David's like, yes, there is none like it. Give it to me. So obviously when David is saying like there's no sword like Goliath, like What's its distinctive feature, right? I'm going to simply assume the obvious thing. Occam's razor, the thing that needs the least assumptions is probably correct. But it's probably that because it was a giant sword, because it was used by, well, a giant. And so David's like, that sword's gonna make me look awesome. It's not the most practical weapon, but it scores me badass points when I'm using that thing. So I'm gonna take it. To be fair though, what guy doesn't want to look like an awesome anime character running around with a giant sword that looks like it can just shred through a car or something? I mean, David was obviously not skipping that chance. And to be fair, most people wouldn't. Who wouldn't want to use a cool giant sword anyway? Well, I guess we have the last part of the chapter to talk about, where David goes to Gath, I guess, and meets Achish, the king of Gath. And then, like, it's funny where David shows up, right? And Gath's like, oh, a guy wants to join my army? Cool. And then his guys are all like, wait, isn't this the guy that's, like, known for killing, like, tens of thousands of people? I don't really want this guy around. And, I mean, in the Gathites' defense, yeah, I wouldn't want a guy who's got a body count in the tens of thousands hanging around my guys, right? I don't know how I feel about that. Especially when he might have, he could have been a former enemy. A former enemy with a high body count. Kind of not the guy I want to have around. And so, it's just kind of this David kind of just like plays possum here and just goes like, I'm not David. I don't know what you're talking about. And then I guess somehow the dumb act he plays ends up working. So, Gathite's clearly not all there. Or at least not the Gathites. More like Achish is just a lousy king. And he's just like, yeah, this crazy guy's not it. I guess David's act was that good, or Achish is that dumb, or a good combination of both. But somehow David got away, right? Because I'm sure most of the other Gathites were probably like, we should probably kill this guy. Probably not a good idea to have him around. But, I mean, if you think about it, it's part of what attributes David with his, like, great intelligence, right? Because it's assumed David is extremely intelligent. After all, he's a brilliant military tactician, so he's got to be pretty smart. And if he's a brilliant military tactician, I guess he's smart enough to worm his way out of, like, the clutches of nearby enemies. I mean, he's already eluded Saul a bunch of times, and eluding these Gathites must have been, like, easy for him. I don't know. It just makes you wonder how David actually got away with, like, the crazy man act. Alright. Just gonna take a quick juice box break. And then we'll continue on with chapter 22. Chapter 22. So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontent gathered around him, and David became their commander. About 400 men were with him. From there David went to Mizpah in Moab, and said to the king of Moab, Would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me? So he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold. Go into the land of Judah. Oh, sorry. Wow, I skipped that. But the prophet Gad said to David, I skipped the line there. It's verse 5. So the prophet Gad said to David, Do not stay in the stronghold. Go into the land of Judah. So David went to the forest of Herath. Now Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered, and Saul was seated, spear in hand, under the tamarisk on the hill at Gibeah. Tamarisk is a type of tree. Verse 7. And Saul said to them, Listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give all you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you have conspired against me? No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me as he does today. But Doeg the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's office officials, said, I saw the son of Jesse come with Ahimelech, son of Abitub, at Nob. So Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. Sorry, it's still Doeg talking. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Then the king sent for the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and all the men of his family, who were the priests at Nob. And they all came to the king. And Saul said to them, Listen now, son of Ahitub. Yes, my lord, he answered. And Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait of me, as he does today? Ahimelech answered the king, But who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair. But the king said, You will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family. Yikes. Then the king ordered the guards at his side, Turn and kill the priest of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. But the king's officials were unwilling to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. The king then ordered Doeg, You turn and strike down the priest. So Doeg, the Edomite, turned and struck them down. And that day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men, its women, its children and infants, its cattle, donkeys, and sheep. Basically, he killed everybody. Well, but one son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to join David. He told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, That day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul. I am responsible for the death of your family. Stay with me and don't be afraid. The man who wants to kill you is trying to kill me too. You will be safe with me. Not the most reassuring words, David, but Abiathar doesn't have much choice, does he? Poor kid. So chapter 22. As I just said, as we were reading chapter 21, David not telling Ahimelech the truth, it ended up costing a lot. Cost a lot of lives. Of course, it's easy to say, like, well, Saul's the one who's more at fault, right? Because, I think it is a bit of an overreaction to kill everybody because a priest did something that he didn't know was not right, quote unquote, right? But of course, Ahimelech is just trying to be a nice guy, right? You gotta feel bad for him, right? He's just a priest trying to do the right thing. He's just trying to be a nice guy, and he gets lied to, and then he gets butchered. It's just not right, But with that being said, this is once again the reason why you can't trust in human kings, right? And the danger that God warned the people about human kings, right? That they go around trying to do whatever they want, right? Punishing a priest for being a nice guy is not indicative of like what you want in good leadership, right? What you want in any leadership, right? And so once again, like Saul in his descent to madness, he's crossed a number of lines, right? This is definitely him crossing a line. Even some of his guys knew that like Saul was going a bit too far, right? Where a lot of the officials were like they're disobeying the king, right? And like, oh, we're not gonna kill the priests, right? They're supposed to be the priests of God. These are like some of the most important people in our society. We're not gonna raise a blade to them. And then of course like Saul gets Doeg the Edomite to do it. And of course like, well, why would Doeg just do it? Because of course like he doesn't care about like Israel's system, right? So the fact that these Nod is supposed to be, or Nob is supposed to be like a holy town because it's like a town of a bunch of priests, right? The priest town. But Doeg had like no regard for that, right? So that's why he would just do it. But think about this for a moment, and you got to think of like the perspective of like Saul's guys, right? His officials, right? They're like, what? How can we possibly follow a guy that like entrusts someone who's possibly our enemy, an Edomite, right? A foreigner, to basically kill like important people in our society, right? That's a thing to really consider, right? And that's a dangerous. That's when your leadership is in real trouble. It's basically down the gutter at that point. Where imagine if your leader, allowed basically. I have a really bad analogy that I don't know if I should use, but maybe I'll use it anyway. This channel is not big, so it's not like anyone's gonna care if I say it. And what's YouTube gonna do, right? So imagine if like the U.S. president was like, you know what, we should let these like illegal immigrants from Mexico come up. Oh, what's that? There's not enough food and there's not enough housing to go around for us to have open borders. Let's just kill Americans to make space. I think that'll work. Imagine if that happened, right? Imagine if like the U.S. like Senate and Congress allowed that, right? Hey, we wanna have open borders from the south and let people come up, but of course, in order to make space, we're just gonna kill Americans, right? Imagine if that's basically what Saul was doing here, right? Which, yeah, not good, right? And when I word it like that, of course, it sounds like super bad, right? Because that's how bad Saul's actions actually are. Which is why it's easier to like, sure, David lied, and that's a bad thing, but Saul's like way worse, right? Of course, this is a common thing that when people read the Bible and tend to forget that David is not the greatest guy either, they tend to just say like they just tend to focus on like how much worse Saul is. And I mean that's true, Saul is worse. But like you can't excuse that like David did end up getting, Ahimelech killed. Now of course one of David's virtues is that David will actually own up to stuff, right? David will actually be like, oh, well I gone screwed up, right? I messed up real bad. And David admits this to Abiathar, right? And Abiathar is like the only survivor of the town. Nowhere else to go. And David like takes him in, partly out of guilt probably, right? Because he's like, well, it was my fault that your whole family's dead. Sorry about that, guy. And of course, the least reassuring words like, well, Saul is out to kill you, but he's out to kill me too. So I think it's just best if we stick together. I mean, on the one hand, where else is Abiathar going to go, right? He can't go anywhere. But on the other hand, sticking with David puts a target on him, right? Because he's like, well, now I'm hanging out with basically a fugitive, which means that I am also a fugitive by associating myself with a fugitive. I am also a fugitive. So if he gets caught, we're all dead. So, I mean, poor Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, is like the most screwed of screwed people here. Like, that is beyond screwed, right? But of course, Abiathar is kind of important because, like, well, he's the only surviving priest of this area, which means he's the only person by right to do, all the ceremonial rites. But it's interesting. It's one of those things that like one of David's virtues is that like David does own up to stuff that he does, and he does own up to it, even though it's a little bit too little, too late. But he does still own up to it, and he tells Abiathar like, "Hey, man, like you want to hate me, that's fine, but I think it's best if we stick together." And Abiathar's like, "Yeah, I don't have much choice now, do I?" But David does own up to what he does, which is very different from Saul, right? Saul just kind of blames David for all his problems and blames other people, whereas David will own up to his own misdoing, his own misdeeds, right? And that's why people like David a lot more, and why people think David is actually a pretty good guy, because I mean, compared to a lot of people, he is good, because there's a lot of people, unfortunately, that will never own up to their own mistakes and will always just blame someone else, right? But of course, and when we see those people in real life, we hate those kind of people, right? And you should hate those people that, blame everyone else for their problems. You know, that's pathological narcissism, right? Well, I'm so good. I can't possibly be the cause of my own problems. It's clearly someone else's fault. But that's when we run into those people, we're like, well, how far is your head up your own ass to think that, right? And so that's Saul's kind of like that, whereas David will own up to his own misdeeds. And that's kind of an important thing, right? Because David does have a number of them. Not all of them he'll own up to, but he's already got a better track record than Saul. Which I guess, on the other hand, isn't much of a benchmark, is it? After all, Saul is not good on his oath count, and he's not good on owning up to things. So, I mean, to compare David with Saul is not much of a benchmark, right? I'm just thinking about like, okay, we'll read chapter 23 and then we'll end the stream. I know it's going to be a little bit shorter because I did kind of just rush through all these. I didn't rush through them, but I just moved quickly because I don't have a lot to say about these chapters. There's not as much to say about them as other chapters do. Because this story is just kind of like, how do I put it? It's a cerebral battle going on between like Saul and David, right? And you just kind of see like one guy's really bad and the other guy is really good compared to him, right? So, and then chapter 24 actually starts like a little story arc that I like to read it with other chapters. So I don't want to read 24 yet. And I mean, to be fair, we've already gone through like chapter 19, 20, and 21. So we already done 3 chapters today, which is a lot. So, and 22. So 19, 20, 21, 22. We read through 4 chapters just now. We're moving through pretty fast here. I thought the Book of Samuel was going to take me longer, but I guess if I'm powering through chapters like this, then we'll move through pretty quickly. Ola, Rebozo. Hola. Welcome to the stream. So we're just going to read through chapter 23, and then we'll call it. Because also my throat is dying. But I think chapter 23 is a good place to stop, because chapter 24, 25, 26 does this really cool thing I want to talk about in its own stream. That will kind of be the plan for next week. Of course, like I'll probably read chapter 27 as well, but chapter 24, 25, 26 kind of do it like this little cool thing. So we'll put that for next week's stream. Alright, chapter 23. When David was told, "Look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and are looting the threshing floors," David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up and attack the Philistines?" And the Lord answered him, "Go, attack the Philistines, and save Keilah." Because of course God would say it in an epic way, right? But David's men said to him, "Here in Judah we are afraid. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces?" Once again David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, "Go down to Keilah, for I am going to give the Philistines into your hands." So David and his men went to Keilah, fought the Philistines, and carried off their livestock. Sweet, free food. He inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. Now Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, had brought the ephod down with him when he fled to David at Keilah. Now Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, "God has delivered him into my hands, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars." And Saul called up his forces for battle, to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. When David learned that Saul was plotting against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod." "Bring the ephod," David said. "Lord, God of Israel, your servant has heard definitely that Saul plans to come to Keilah and destroy the town on account of me. Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? Lord, God of Israel, tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will." Again David asked, "Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul?" And the Lord said, They will. So David and his men, about 600 of them, left Keilah and kept moving from place to place. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he did not go there. So David stayed in the wilderness stronghold, and in hills of the desert of Ziph. Day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. While David was at Horesh, in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son, Jonathan, went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. The Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh, on the hill of Hakilah, south of Jeshimon? Now, your majesty, come down whenever it pleases you to do so, and we will be responsible for giving him into your hands." Saul replied, "The Lord bless you for your concern for me. Go and get more information. Find out where David usually goes and who has seen him there. They tell me he is very crafty. Find out about all the hiding places he uses and come back to me with definite information. Then I will go with you. If he is in the area, I will track him down among all the clans of Judah." So they set out and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the desert of Maon? Was not Maon. Maon. I'm going to say Maon. In the Arabah, south of Jeshimon. Saul and his men began to search, and when David was told about it, he went down to the rock and stayed in the desert of Maon. When Saul heard this, he went into the desert of Maon in pursuit of David. Now Saul was going along one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other, hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture him, a messenger came to Saul saying, "Come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land." Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David, and they went to meet the Philistines. That is why they call this place, oh my gosh, how do you pronounce this? Hamalekoth. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. That last one was really hard to pronounce. So, yeah. This is where, like, Saul's gone full bonkers, right? Because he's like, we're going to cut no expenses. We're going to find David and we're going to kill him. And so, the next little while, basically, Saul's going to be chasing David around, and they basically play this game of cat and mouse. Where, you know, Saul comes with this big army. Just remember, he's got, like, he's got the Israelite army behind his back, so a couple thousand guys at the very least. Probably easily in the tens of thousands of guys, right? Whereas, like, David's got, like, what? 600 guys? Not that many. And of course, like, David's guys are, like, a bunch of outcasts. I didn't mention this earlier, because I didn't think it was relevant then, and, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, I guess by the time we hear more about them in, like, Second Samuel, they've obviously gained battle experience, but like David's guys, I don't think they started out as like hardened warriors like he is. Like David is the battle hardened warrior, but a lot of his guys, oh, excuse me, yawn of the stream. Like a lot of David's guys probably were like, well, they were poorer guys, right? So they probably didn't have like combat training. Sure, like as I mentioned earlier, in the ancient world, everybody knew how to had basic combat skills because everybody needed it to survive in the cruel world that they lived in. But they weren't like soldiers, right? And the funny thing is that like Saul's army is all the soldiers, right? David's guys are a bunch of outcasts. They're a bunch of nobodies, right? Poor men, probably from like crappy farmlands that couldn't pay off debts or bring enough yield or whatever. These poor men, and probably like the disenfranchised, right? And that's another reason why David seems like a much more appealing guy, right? Because he's accommodating, right? He brings all the disenfranchised guys into his fold, whereas like Saul represents like the status quo, right? And his guys are like the regular guys, right? They're the status quo, and David is like this for the people person, right? But then of course by the time we get to Second Samuel, all of these guys have gained battle experience because we did read that like earlier in chapter 23 they did liberate Keilah or Keilah. I think it was Keilah. So anyways, they liberated Keilah, right? So these guys started picking up battle experience, and as we read through later chapters, David and his men will fight off like these little Philistine raids here and there. And so they obviously get better at fighting. But it's interesting that like, David manages to muster up these guys and they become like actual warriors, and later on, some of these guys are like they're like some pretty badass fighters later on, but or in the earlier days they're probably like just a bunch of thugs, right? Then we have a little bit with like, Saul's big plan to like hunt David down. He's like, well, you guys are gonna find out where he's hiding and where he likes to hide, and then when we get all our information, we're gonna swarm him, and I'm gonna come personally to bring an end to David, right? But of course, God does provide, doesn't he? Where Saul's on David's pursuit, but instead of being able to maintain the pursuit, Saul gets kind of pulled back to reality, right? Because this hunting down for like what, a dude with 600 guys, like if Saul were to act like a king, this would be beneath him, right? And this is one of those other things that like if you think about it that way, like Saul is not fit to be king because he's doing something petty like hunting down one guy who's in the grand scheme of things pretty insignificant, right? At least that's how he should be viewed. Like David should be viewed as pretty insignificant, and Saul shouldn't be wasting his time. But if Saul and his descent into madness, he's so focused on David that he's like, we're gonna send all these guys just to kill David and his like, band of thugs, right? Instead of, oh, I don't know, protecting your own people. Instead of, oh, I don't know, taking care of the Philistines, right? But Saul he's so out of touch, right? That all he can think of is like hunting David down. But of course, there's this little moment, this miracle that, God kind of uses, Saul's guys to pull him back to reality. It's like, hey man, like, we got Philistine raids over here. We better take care of this. It's kind of our job. It's kind of our job to take care of these Philistines, right? And Saul's like, yeah, we better go meet them. And so Saul getting pulled back to reality for a brief moment. it's nothing short of a miracle from God, right? And that's where, like, sure, the story kind of plays out like in normal fashion, but if you think about how, like, throughout the story, Saul's kind of basically become a nut job. And anytime he has these more sane moments, is like, yeah, God is acting to save everyone else's life from Saul, right? Because if you think about it, Saul is potentially a very huge danger to his own people because of how insane he's become, basically. And the chapter ends with David hanging out in a place called En Gedi, which I've been to. It's a nice little crag of rocks with a river running through it. Not much to say about it. But I've been there. I've been to En Gedi. I've been to some of these places, right? Because I did a pilgrimage in, like, the Middle East, like, years ago. Which I think how long it was, like 13 years or something like that. It's a long time ago. I say it like that, it makes it sound like I'm even older than I actually am. Oh. But anyway, so yeah, basically, even though Saul has been pulled back to reality to, like, fight the Philistines and do his job, basically, we'll read in the next few chapters where, like, Saul goes back on his crazy train and he's hunting David, right? And it's all he can think about is tracking David down, but you know he'll get showed up. Let's just say that, and we'll see some neat stuff happen in chapter 24 and later. But I want to save those chapters for the next stream. So with that being said, this is more or less going to be the end. This is where I'm going to stop reading for today. I think we read through like 4 chapters, right? 19, 20, 5 chapters, right? We just read through 5 chapters pretty quickly there, and powered through it. 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. Yeah, so 5 chapters. We read through 5 chapters. I think that's a lot of headway. Once again, read it again yourselves and look at these little, like, interesting details about how, like, the mental state of characters and how, they process what's happening in the world to them. Evaluate that with yourself and see, like, well, how do I line up my life, and am I thinking straight? And these are all questions we all gotta ask ourselves, and the dangers of, like, leaders that do lose touch with reality, right? And how dangerous that can be, as we see with Saul. But anyway, this is gonna be the end. I'm just gonna do a bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, I can tackle them. I mean, we still have a fair amount of time if you guys want to ask questions. But otherwise, I'll just do some housekeeping and then we'll kind of end the stream. So first and foremost, next week, the schedule looks pretty simple. I'll probably play the StarCraft 2 Nova covert missions. Probably do all 3 mission packs in the Monday and Wednesday streams. I should be able to cover all of them in, like, 2 streams. I don't think Nova missions are actually that long. So it should only take me like 2 streams to do it. So there's that. That will be Monday, Wednesday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. I will be playing StarCraft 2, doing the Nova missions. And that the 2 days should probably take care of it. Then Throwback Thursday, playing more Heroes by Magic 2. And then finally we have, so Thursday we have Throwback Thursday with Heroes by Magic 2. I don't know if I'll finish the rolling campaign by then. I don't think I'll be able to finish it because it's still it's a pretty big map, so I'll probably have to take a little while for that. But still playing Heroes by Magic 2 next Thursday. And then, of course, Friday we'll continue on with David versus Saul in 1 Samuel. And that will be next Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time, as the same today. That's it for announcements. I'll wait a minute if you have any questions. If not, we'll end the stream. Also gotta check this thing here. I don't know why my phone was bothering me so much. It's like, oh, just some ad from Google. It's like, oh, come on. Don't waste my time like that. Anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed reading through the book of Samuel with me. You guys learned something. And I will see you guys next week for StarCraft 2, Heroes by Magic, and of course, our next reading stream. You guys have a great Friday. I hope you guys have a great rest of your great weekend. And God bless you.